I want to welcome you to this presentation. And I would like to thank my son, Andres, for encouraging me to do this lecture. It is a controversial subject, and I have been receiving email and things of that nature. But I would like to say that this cause is my cause. I am a Mexican immigrant, and I have dedicated to immigrants my entire career. I worked in the consulate. I've been in the fields. I can attest of the goodness of the immigrant, of the decency of the immigrant. I have felt the pain that has become especially acute in the past few years. And so this is a presentation where I speak not only of what I've studied, but also of what I've lived. And I am very grateful that you're with me in this Easter Saturday to talk about one of the most important issues of our time. Lindy, this presentation is called The Plight of the Immigrants. Immigration is an essential part of life. We see it in humanity throughout its history, in birds. Somehow the symbol of immigrants has been the monarch butterfly that comes all the way from Canada, crosses the US, and reaches finally Angangueo, Michoacan, in Mexico City. And I was very encouraged by the photographs of my friend Olivia Barrio Nuevo about these same subjects. I encourage you to look her up and see her lovely photographs. And I would like to say that I based this presentation in the last book John Kennedy wrote. It's called A Nation of Immigrants. In my opinion, it is the best that has been written about the subject. It is powerful, intelligent, with this extraordinary use of language. If there is one book I would like to give President Biden, it would be this one. I think unfortunately, it's a book that was published not by a publisher, but by the Anti-Defamation League. So it's not as well read as it should be. But it is a book that says everything that I believe in a manner that is beautiful and convincing. And I would like to begin to say that we are all immigrants. Once Oscar Handlin wrote that I thought to write a history of immigrants in America. And I discovered that the immigrants were American history. All of us, including the Native Americans, are immigrants. We're all immigrants or children of immigrants. Either people that crossed the Bering Straits. And if you think that the desert or the oceans are hard, imagine what that must have been like. Some others believe that people immigrated by using the currents of the Pacific Ocean. But most of the original Americans came from Europe, different countries, in overcrowded ships, in conditions that were just absolutely unbearable, where Many died in the route to America. And of course, the African Americans came in conditions that were even worse, against their will and enslaved. But there has always been this ambivalent reaction towards immigrants. On the one hand, the nation attracts them, is built by them. But at the same time, there's been a resistance. This cartoon that I'm showing to you is more than 100 years old. And sadly, a lot of the anti-immigrant feeling has also been used to express discrimination against people that are different. And yet, the promise of immigration has shaped, has transformed this country. But what we are now facing, we are in a crossroads. It is true that there has been anti-immigrant movements before, nativist movements before, the so-called know-nothings of the middle of the 19th century. But there's always been, at the highest levels of our society, the understanding that immigrants are a good thing, are a positive thing. Because immigrants remind every American that change is the essence of life. And immigration infused the nation with a commitment to far horizons and new frontiers. But what we have seen in the past 4 years has no precedent. What it amounts to is the criminalization of immigrants. The adoption from the very top of our society to the harshest measures, and the constant lying about immigrants. What Goebbels used to say, the lie that he's repeated 1,000 times. And immigrants that have come to work to offer the best that they have been treated as invaders, as trespassers. Still remember when President Trump said that Mexico sent its rapists, its criminals. A lie that I know personally. And once you create a boogeyman, once you create an invader, an enemy, then you can justify even the most brutal measures. The cruelty in the border, the separation of families, the losing of children, these are not accidents, but actions planned deliberately as a deterrent to immigrants. And once one tolerates things like what we have seen in the past years, once it's okay to put a child in a cage or to separate a child from his mother, and one doesn't do anything, it reminds me of that famous quote of Martin Niemöller. First, they came for the socialists, but I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, but I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. It's much comfortable not to speak about immigration, but I think it is more important than ever. And it is not an accident either that the symbol of liberty given to the US by France, and according to some recent studies modeled by a Syrian woman, is also the symbol of immigrants, the Statue of Liberty. And yet, in the past few decades, we have been seeing another sign related to immigrants. It is a cautionary sign on the roads that identifies migrant families in a very similar way that you caution people against deer or other animals. These two symbols, the Statue of Liberty and the cautionary road sign, are incompatible. And they express the crossroads that we are in. Whether we will continue to be a nation that welcomes immigrants, or will we become a closed society? And every time that somebody speaks about this issue, the way of canceling all discussion is by saying, oh, so what you're advocating for is open borders so that anybody can come. No, that is not what one is advocating. But the possibility of immigration reform is a dream that has been so much postponed, more than 30 years. But now it is more important than ever. So that is the subject of tonight's presentation. In his book, Kennedy affirms that there is few things as difficult as uprooting yourself and your family from a place where you have lived for centuries. Break completely with the past and start again in an unknown land. Why do people do it? First, let me remember another enlightened definition of America by Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocrat and author, one of the most brilliant minds of the 19th century. And he came to the US in 1831. And he found it so different from what he had experienced in the class-ridden Europe. And not only in Europe, but also in countries that should be very similar to the US, such as Canada and Australia. All three vast territories colonized by very similar people, British. Of course, difference in social class. It's very different, the people that originally went to Australia than to Canada or the US, but with more in common than apart. And yet, the US is so totally different from the other two. And de Tocqueville was wondering why. Why is the US so different? And after much thought, what he concluded is that the difference, the spirit of equality in the US exists because it is a nation of immigrants. Each beginning life anew on equal footing. That is the great secret of America. One of the problems of the world, and even Latin America, is that the first Europeans that colonized Mexico or Argentina tend to become an aristocracy, an idle class. But that doesn't happen in the US. And you know why? Because as soon as the original British were getting comfortable, you have the arrival of 5 million German immigrants. And these 5 million German immigrants compete, work harder, establish symphony orchestras and kindergartens, bring their cuisine, their churches, and force the others to compete as well. And yes, certainly they make them very uncomfortable. And then when the Germans are assimilated, come the Italians, and then the Polish and the Jews, and every new wave of immigrants refreshes the country, makes it young again, keeps it competitive again. That is why canceling the immigration project is so deeply anti-American. Because what it does is it creates a permanent underclass instead of a mobile society. Now, these people that came with nothing, people that could be our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents, that left everything, did it basically for 3 reasons. They were taking these tremendous risks, going to someplace unknown, in dangerous waters. And that impulse is the same. The same danger confronted crossing an ocean is now crossing a desert. So why did these people immigrate? Well, many of them were looking for religious freedom, the right to worship in respect. And the fact that there were many different religions, many different Protestant churches, and the fact that each wanted to be respected produced a respect for the others. the tolerance of other religious beliefs. A second great reason is political oppression. Despotic governments, tyrants, dictatorships of whatever ideology. People yearning not to be oppressed. Not to be jailed or murdered because of your political beliefs. And thirdly, because they were pursuing economic opportunity, because they concluded, both then and now, that there was no opportunity, whether it is a Polish worker, an Irish fleeing from the famine, a Chinese who would build in unbearable conditions some of the most important railroads of the country, and sometimes even be deported afterwards. But all this desire to pursue these immediate passions are exactly the great promise of America. What is the great promise of this country? Precisely political pluralism, religious tolerance, and economic opportunity. So, in a way, every immigrant with his or her sole presence reconfirms and rejuvenates the basic values upon which this nation is founded. So, another basic characteristic, and that is the orientation of time. In most countries, the past is always present. You're born in families, in trades, and most of the time, only those people that are extraordinarily gifted tend to stay in the place where they were born, to follow the mold in which they came to this world. If you're a peasant, most of the times you continue to be a peasant, or if you're a professional, a doctor, a professor, whatever it is. But when somebody immigrates and breaks all ties with the past and comes to a land where there is no mold, where what matters is not the past, but the future. And where anybody can go as high and as far as he can. And this mentality of the immigrant becomes the mentality of the country. The US is the only nation where the future is more important than the past. And this collective act of reinvention, this enormous effort to become something different, something new, enriches and transforms the country. It would have been absolutely impossible for the Kennedys to become what they did had they stayed in Ireland. And the same is true about so many people. There are more students from Oaxaca studying in California than in Mexico City. So the future orientation, the vehemency of the beliefs, and the effort of reinvention has been the singular motor, the most important motor of entrepreneurship, of inventiveness, of development of the country. And thirdly, every new group that comes, whether it is Jewish or Italian or Polish or Mexican or Korean, brings its own traditions and its own cultures. And these cultures, this way of cooking, this way of preparing, this way of seeing becomes part and enriches the common culture. And we can see it in every aspect of American cuisine. They're all immigrant dishes: the Irish stew, the chop suey, the goulash, the ravioli, the bratwurst, the Spanish omelet, the caviar, the mayonnaise, the English muffins, the tamales, the paella, the Chinese dumplings. They all come, the tacos now, the pupusas from El Salvador. The richness of music, of rhythms, and of course, the contributions of the African Americans are also contributions of immigrants. So that is the conceptual framework that Kennedy establishes when looking at immigration. And after Europe, perhaps the single greatest source of immigrants has been Latin America and very importantly, Mexico. The history between Mexico and the US is complex. Originally, this was the map of Mexico. And so in the war, in the mid-19th century, Mexico lost half of its territory. Places that we now live in here, like California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, all of that was once Mexico. And so there are, of course, people who can legitimately say that they didn't cross the border, that the border crossed them. And the movement of people has always existed. I remember growing up in Mexico, it was almost a tradition. People came some seasons to the US, worked hard, mostly in the agricultural field, did some savings, and then came back to their town in Mexico and opened a store. And that little money was worth a lot more in Mexico. And the border was not militarized. It was easier to move freely through the border. Now, in addition to this informal exchange that has existed forever, since that part of the US was Mexican territory. But there has also been very successful formal agreements, beginning in World War II from 1942 until 1964. There were millions of Mexicans in the so-called Bracero program that existed to work and to cover some of the vacancies of the many men that went to war. And this workforce did an extraordinary job. Some of them remained, but many more came back to Mexico. And there are still examples of the work that they did. Now, in more recent history, when Mexico signed with the US and Canada the North American Free Trade Agreement, and even before, you have a major readjustment of the economies. I remember the crisis in Mexico, the devaluation of the peso. Remember, it used to be 12.50 to $1, then 50, then 100, then 1,000. There was a time when we earned millions of pesos and were poorer than ever. In the mid-'80s, there's this gigantic earthquake in Mexico City. And then the resurgence of crime and desperate situation for so many. And when NAFTA is signed, there are some sectors that benefit, but others, like especially the smaller shops that now have to compete with the Walmarts of this world. So a lot of people were unemployed or underemployed. And so one of the results of this crisis is a very large migration to the US. Nowadays, at present, perhaps the largest migration center towards the US comes from Central America. And the history of Central America is deeply intertwined with the US. This beautiful region of exquisitely fertile ground. Look at these paintings by the great Nicaraguan painter Armando Morales. But Central America has also a history of exploitation. In Guatemala, a country that produces many agricultural products, but especially bananas and coffee. And every effort to achieve better justice for the people fails. The effort of Sandino, and later in the 50s, you have in Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, that tries to regulate and find a more fair balance with the United Fruit Company that owns large parts of the country. And the result is military coups, dictatorships, oppression, the imposition of the worst tyrants, supported by the US and the large corporations. One by one, monsters like Anastasio Somoza and so many more. And in the 80s and 90s, you have revolutionary efforts in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, that are also met with the funding of the Contras and other violent counterinsurgencies. And also the war, the injustice, the poverty, produces a migration of Central Americans to the US. Now, one of the worst traits of the Central American wars is that the armies recruited often children. And so when these immigrants come to the US and are victimized by the gangs here, they end up creating hyper-violent gangs. And again, when these gang members are apprehended in the US, the one group that should have remained in jail, what does the US do? It sends them right back to Central America. So now you have a situation of disaster, of failed economies, a pervasive violence. And a lot of those people are trying to find a better life. But the problem at the border is not the problem of the border. One has to address the root issues that make people come to the border. Yes, it is true that the hope of a new president and a more humane policy has attracted a lot of people. But the solution is not just to treat the people that are here, but to try to make better conditions for people in Central America and Mexico, to create incentives for people to not have to emigrate. For many years, the US justified its support for the worst tyrants because of the Cold War. You know, there is a famous description of Somoza by a US president that said, he is a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch. And because they were anti-communist, the US supported the most corrupt, vilest people. There is no need for that now. And what would hope for a more enlightened policy towards Central America. And I feel very ashamed of my own country. And it's the treatment that it gives those Central Americans who are abused by everyone, by the police, by the cartels, it's just heartbreaking. But again, you're talking of wonderful people. While living in Washington, I had the opportunity to live in close connection with the Salvadoran community. And I can say that they want what everybody wants. Decent, hardworking, generous. As the Nicaraguans, as the people from Honduras, or certainly Costa Rica, with such a great democratic tradition. That's the one exception of Central America. A nation with no army. Others come fleeing totalitarianism in tires or tiny boats, or cross the desert. And this construction of walls is not a new thing. It has been going on for many years now. But the argumentation that these immigrants that are willing to risk their lives for an opportunity are illegal, and quoting what is often said to them, they should get at the line. Well, there is no line. Our immigration system has been broken for decades. And there is a contradiction between what the economy needs and what the laws provide. So there is a lot of need and opportunity for people to work in the agricultural sector or in the service sector or in the healthcare sector. And as soon as they come, they have work, but there is no legal way for a campesino to get a work permit. Unless you are a relative here, or you have a specialized degree, or you're sponsored by somebody, it is impossible to be legal. And every time that there is an attempt to come up with a more realistic legislation, nobody wants illegality. But here you have a contradiction with the economic demands and the laws, and the refusal to change the laws for political reasons. And this contradiction has been exploited by all kinds of demagogues, has been used politically in very immoral ways. It is not even a Democratic or Republican issue. The last immigration reform happened under President Ronald Reagan. And I remember in 2006, when finally, and very much inspired by our kids, our children that pushed us into the streets. And there was these large immigration marches in which people wanted to be legal, wanted to pay taxes, and they do pay taxes. The idea that, like this man, I'm a taxi driver, I'm not a terrorist. I remember I participated in that march with these two giant puppets of Frida and Diego. But there was no immigration reform. More of the same, with an important exception. President Obama did an executive order protecting the dreamers, DACA, these kids that were brought to the US as children and that did all their career here. And then when they reach adulthood, find that they are foreigners. Now, what caught my attention dramatically last year was a point when the agricultural workers were called illegal but essential. How can that be? Somebody that is illegal and essential. Well, you find that 47% of the agricultural industry, one of the pillars of America, 47% are illegal immigrants. %27% of the agricultural workers, 36% of custodial workers, 24% of food preparation. And most people that have met an immigrant worker not only open their homes to them, but they make them in charge of their most precious aspects of their lives, the care of their parents and their children. Some years ago, there was this article in the New York Times. It was called "The Other Mothers of Manhattan." And at the same time that you see these people working hard, complementing, frankly, the labor, because a nanny can help that mother work, the immigrant labor does not take the jobs of those people, it complements the job. Either it is in the agricultural or in the service sectors, producing jobs in the middle class, or whether it is the highly specialized immigrants. And so we come to the present, the urgency of the now. Some very serious things happened in the past few years. For the first time, the legality of our elections were questioned. And the issue of immigration became a priority, to be exploited in the cruelest way. And in a frankly abusive way, Trump threatened Mexico with tariffs as high as 50%, which would have effectively bankrupted the country. And the only way to avoid them was to block the Central Americans that are trying to come to the US. And then the symbol of all this, the wall. And the deliberate cruelty against all immigrants, legal and illegal. People that had been waiting for years for a green card, had done everything right. Refugees that had always been welcome here, blocked. And one of the most dramatic of all was the state of limbo of the DACA students. Students that I know, that I have taught, some of the best of the country. Who live from a legal opinion to another. And some, even the most needed, also threatened with deportation. But perhaps the cruelest has been the attitude towards families and children's. Children in cages, separated from their parents. And what has not been talked about is the effect of these issues in the immigrant community itself. What these measures have done is to very much hurt the heart of many immigrants. These people that come to work to produce, that are the hope to rescue programs like Social Security and many others, and who work with the expectation of improving in practicing that American dream. But there can be no real progress without immigration reform. And so what we're looking at is, instead of a new wave of immigration that enriches the country, the creation of a permanent underclass. I want to share with you a poem of my friend Teresa Lefranc that pretty much captures how many immigrants feel today. She says, I had a life, I was free, I had a voice. Here I am nothing, if anything a statistic. I have no identity. What am I? Who am I? I am a scream that fades out, a longing lost in the nothingness of indifference. I am a broken dream. They want my work, they want my money, but me they don't want. I am the undesirable, the scapegoat. I am the pawn in the chess game. I have sweated blood, leaving my life in the fields, in the factories. I am the gardener, the cook, the housekeeper, the nanny. I live as a slave in the 21st century. What am I? Who am I? I am grandmother, father, mother, brother, son, friend. But above all, I am a human being who only wants to have his dignity back. And yet, in the midst of this cruel propaganda war of lies, the spirit of America still shines. I'm very moved by people that go to the desert and leave water for those immigrants. And as I received today from my friend Teresa Grana, some of the greatest Americans yesterday and today are immigrants. almost every economist agrees of the positive contributions of immigrants. And the idea that perhaps the only effective way of competing with China is by unleashing the power of the immigrant labor. And immigrants rejuvenate society. What is happening in Europe is also happening in the US. Europe becoming a society of old people, where the population is so old that they've had to modify the plants. And then the vibrancy of the culture, the possibilities of knowing and connecting with so many worlds, with so many cuisines, with so many traditions. The contributions in science and entertainment, in labor. And the idea, these photographs that I'm sharing with you are from different periods, but I've made them all black and white. And it's very hard to tell the difference. Who came 2 years ago and who came 100 years ago. So I would like to use my voice to promote the idea that immigration is an issue that we must think about, that we must reform, that we must live up to our legacy. And that figure of liberty that at its feet affirms, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Send these to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Thank you very much.